A really great question I get asked a lot is, what should my recovery look like when I'm doing a high intensity interval training session or any intervals, maybe that be threshold, VO2 max, whatever it might be. So in this video, I'm going to break down my simple couple of rules that aren't necessarily scientific or ingrained, but I find they work really well to match some of those scientific principles around getting the right recovery intensity, but then also trying to work out what the best work to rest ratio is to get the most out of your interval training. Hey, welcome back to the channel. Nick here, talking science of endurance and everything sports science in general. Great to have you back. If you have been enjoying the videos, please consider subscribing down below. Continue to grow this great community, should I say. We're getting very, very close to 3,000 subscribers, which is absolutely unbelievable. And head over to @NJ_sportscience over on Instagram. We've ticked over the 1,000 mark, and let's keep growing the community over there. Some really good additional content to what comes here on the channel, a bit more of my day-to-day and what's going on, some training things that I'm doing if you want to keep up to date with that, what I'm doing in the lab at work, a bunch of other things as well. So go check that one out and let's continue to grow our great community across both platforms. But as for today, as I mentioned in the introduction, we're talking about recovery from intervals, recovery between intervals, work to rest ratios, the whole lot. And I wanted to start with really my simple rule of how do I identify, and it comes off the questions of athletes I've been working with recently and talking to and consulting with. How do we, I guess, process or choose the type of recovery, whether it be a jogging recovery, walking, easy spin? Are we doing more of a float recovery? Are we doing a 1-to-1 work to rest, a 2-to-1? How do we sort of process all this information and have a clear system to identify when we should and shouldn't pick certain types of recovery to make sure that our intervals are quality? Because that's obviously the key part of interval type training. We want to make sure that we're getting the most out of the effort time and being able to repeat that effort time, but manipulating the recovery intensity to challenge us a little bit further or provide the quality that we need. So really a simple two processes, really, the two questions or the two parts that I'd like to start with are, first and foremost, the higher the effort intensity, so the higher the intensity you are working in your on efforts, if that makes sense. So the key parts of the session where you are working hard means typically the lower the recovery intensity. I'm going to get to some examples of this in a moment, but the higher the working or on effort intensity is, typically the lower the intensity we're going to go in our recovery. And the second principle I like to sort of follow and use as a guiding tool is the higher the effort intensity, typically, and not always, I've got listed there, not always, but typically is going to lead to a longer recovery period. So if we are working up near VO2 max, which I'll get to in a moment, or maybe even higher, some sprint interval training, we're probably going to be using a longer recovery period to allow us to get that quality done. And I'm going to walk you through a couple of key examples, and these are the key types of sessions that I use with pretty much every athlete throughout any type of program. Some things at VO2 max, some things in around threshold, and then also some sub-threshold type work as well. They're the common types of interval training that you might come across as an endurance athlete. And again, we're looking mainly at endurance here. So the first one being VO2 intervals. Typically, these are going to be greater than 95% of what we call your velocity at VO2 max. So that is your VO2 max pace, essentially. Where does your VO2 max occur? 95% of that, so just below, and then slightly just above. So you can see there, it's going to equate to approximately about 115 or 120% of your FTP or your threshold pace, if you're working off that as a metric. I like to work in percentage of VO2 because I use lab data and it makes sense for me. But if you use percentage of FTP, it's going to be that well and truly above 120% of FTP. We're usually holding these efforts for 2 to 5 minutes in length. So we're holding them for, I guess, a middle period. They're not super short and sharp. Sometimes they can be. We might be doing 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off, and that would still apply to this circumstance because we're working in and around sort of 110% of VO2. But usually they're 2 to 5 minutes for most endurance-based athletes. The longer distance stuff, when I say long distance stuff, really 10K, half marathon, 70.3 triathlete, even Olympic distance triathlete. The endurance components of the slightly longer efforts, those 2 to 5 minute efforts, are going to give us better bang for buck. So in sessions like this, we are working quite hard. We're working near our max. What is the type of recovery we use? Typically, intensity-wise, because we're working right up at 100% of our VO2 max or in and around there, we're going to use something like a walking recovery if we're a runner. Might use a passive recovery. So if we're doing things like 30 second on, 30 second off, repeated 10 times. On the bike, you're working at 110% of VO2 max power. We probably will use a passive recovery, so you're just sitting there. Same for the run, you might do 30 on, 30 off and use a passive recovery. But commonly the intensity is right down because the aim of these sessions is to spend maximum time in that effort area when we are on, spend maximum time at the correct pace or even just above to give us the ideal stimulus. In a session like 2 minute on, 2 minute off, we want to try and accumulate about 12 to 20 minutes of working time in and around VO2 max to give us the stimulus we need. To be able to do that, we need a very low intensity recovery to allow us to fully recover. So each time we hit that up intensity on the on efforts, we can make sure it's quality and we stay consistent. We're not seeing a drop-off pattern. And by the end of the session, we're kind of missing some of the stimulus that we're after. And usually it's a 1-to-1 work to rest ratio. Again, not always, but that 1-to-1 offers that ability to have a quality effort repeatedly over the course of an entire session. So that's what I typically use for those VO2 efforts. A really low intensity recovery, and usually give myself or give the athletes a 1-to-1 work to rest, give them plenty of recovery so we can repeat it again and again and spend maximum time at the intensity we need across the whole session. Moving down a little bit intensity now, we're starting to head towards threshold. So threshold intervals, I call them threshold, or you might want to look at them as a super threshold. So at and just above FTP, 100 to 105% of your threshold power or threshold pace. These are quite often used in that race-specific preparation. A lot of athletes love these, your 1K repeats. Commonly, if we're looking at endurance type stuff, I try to reserve these for 5 to 10 minute efforts. You might be able to sit in there for, get more of that endurance effect on them. But you might actually do some shorter stuff at maybe 105, 110% of threshold. Things like your monofartlek are a good example of that, but that's getting a little bit more complicated. I'm trying to keep these as simple as we can. So a session that might fit in here really well that a lot of athletes, I give to a lot of athletes, is things like 4 by 8 minute on, 4 minute off. And I've kind of given away the work to rest ratio here. But in a session like that, I might use a 2-to-1, so 8 minute on, 4 minute off. Might use a 9 minute on, 3 minute off, so a 3-to-1 work to rest, or even push it up to a 4-to-1 work to rest ratio to really drive the aerobic adaptation we're looking for. Try and stress that aerobic system to not produce as much, to not rely as much on the anaerobic system to help, which is therefore not going to produce as much lactic acid and get us better at I guess, the aerobic processes around it, allows us to be more sustainable, boost up that threshold as a percentage of VO2. Typically, if we're looking at a running example, I find running is a better way to explain it. We're looking like an easy jog in these. So we're on for 5 to 10 minutes, and then we're having an easy jog. And for most people, it's going to be like a low zone 2. So we're not completely off, but we're not holding a float. It's somewhere in between. It's just nice and cruisy, turn the legs over. If you're running your on effort at, say, 4 minute pace, you might be off at, say, 5:30 or maybe even 6 minute Ks. Just a really cruisy jog. And because we have the half recovery, it's going to keep the oxygen consumption a little bit up there. It's going to stress us a little bit more aerobically because we are still moving at a little bit more speed, not quick at all in those recoveries, but we are still moving and accumulating a bit more Ks rather than a walking recovery there. So we're going to get a really good aerobic stimulus out of those more threshold-based intervals. Finally, looking at things like sub-threshold. So if we're now starting to go 100% of FTP or maybe just below 90, 95% of FTP, I call them sub-threshold because we're not exceeding it. You might have a different term for it. Typically, these are things like maybe longer than 10-minute efforts, or if you're going bang on threshold, you might want to go, say, like a shorter effort, like a 5 minute on. And then this is where we start to get into things like a float recovery. So usually it might be a 1-to-1 work to rest. Sometimes it could be a 2-to-1. So we might do 10 minutes on and then a 5 minute float, and then 10 minutes on, 5 minute float. If you're going for like a 95% of FTP, sustained effort, maybe you're a 70.3 triathlete, you might want to try that. It's a bit more of that stressing you for a longer period of time, short recovery, go again. That's going to give us a good aerobic benefit, but also things like maybe 5 minute on at threshold and then a 5 minute float recovery. A float, looking at our example, what is a float compared to a jog? A jog, we said before, if you're running it on efforts at 4 minute Ks, the jog would be something like a 5:30 to 6 minute Ks. A float would be something like a 5 minute K pace. So we're not backing it all the way off. It's almost like a high zone 2. We're sitting at that aerobic threshold, at the top of your zone 2 endurance, and that's all we're dropping down to. So you're actually still feeling like you're working. You're not working hard in the off efforts, but you still feel like you're working. You don't feel like you're getting really big amounts of time to recover. It still allows you to, but we're stressing in a different way. But what you can see here across all of these examples I've given is that as intensity from the on efforts has gone down, our intensity from our recovery effort is actually increasing. So we're actually working in a scale a bit, if I can get it in the picture here, working a scale of this is your on effort, that's your recovery. Intensity is kind of doing this, and then as we decrease our on intensity, we increase our recovery intensity. As we increase our on intensity, we decrease our recovery intensity. So it kind of works as a sliding scale like that. There's some of the key examples. Like I said, it's not an extensive list here, but I just wanted to give you a bit of an idea around the guiding principles I use to then select the type of recovery, and then that also determines the work to rest ratio. If I'm using a float recovery, I'm probably going for a 2-to-1, maybe a 1-to-1 work to rest. If I'm doing a walking recovery, I'm probably going to go for a one-to-one work to rest ratio because the intensity is going to be up there to warrant that walk. So it really does give me a clear picture in my mind of how I can achieve a particular stimulus in a session and maximize the quality. I can't stress that enough. We're all about maximizing the quality of the on efforts. That's where you're going to get your biggest bang for buck. The off efforts are there to help us get through the session, help us allow us to repeat those efforts again and again and again. They're not there to be the main stimulus. The on efforts are the key stimulus. Remember that. So if you can get that right, we can then adjust our recovery accordingly and we can go from there. So hopefully you gained a little bit of insight in terms of my decision-making process around recovery efforts. Do you have any questions about your interval sessions or any great interval sessions that you use below, whether you're a runner, cyclist, triathlete, whatever it might be? What is your favorite interval session? Leave it in the comments down below. I'll put a little comment down there so you can respond. Really interested to hear what your favorite sessions are. As always, continue subscribing to the channel and supporting what we're doing here by clicking the big red button down below, and head over to Instagram at NJ_sportscience to check out all the great additional content on Instagram as well. I'm going to leave it there for today. Hopefully you got something great out of it, and we'll see you in the next one.